Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the session this afternoon from Innovation to Incorporation, part of the Commonwealth Business Forum. My name's Joanna Newman, and I'm Secretary General of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. The ACU has over 500 universities across 53 countries, and therefore our members reflect the diversity of the sector, encompassing both prestigious research-focused universities, but also young and dynamic entrepreneurial institutions busy forging their reputations. We have a fantastic panel of industry and academic experts. We have Professor Andy Hopper, who is Treasurer and Vice Chairman of the Royal Society, Professor of Computer Technology at the University of Cambridge, and Head of the Department of Computer Science and Technology. We have Dato Azman Mahmud, who is the CEO of the Malaysian Investment Development Authority in Malaysia. We have Sir Michael Dixon, who is Director of the Natural History Museum. We have Peter Riddles, who's a board member of CSIRO, Australia. We have Dr. Mike Short, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department for International Trade in the UK. And we have Dr. Tim Hart, who's the Development Director of Oxentia UK. And they'll each have a chance to tell you a little bit about what they do in a few moments. But I wanted to just start with a brief introduction and some context. So, because I run an association of universities, I think that universities matter for science, business, innovation, and economic development. And Lord Deering's words in 2002, which was over 15 years ago, now still ring true. Just as castles provided the source of strength for medieval towns and factories provided prosperity in the industrial age, universities are the source of strength in the knowledge-based economy of the 21st century. But is that the case for science and innovation? Does science and innovation reside in universities only, or is it beginning to happen more outside academia? I'm thinking particularly of entrepreneurship and young people. This session will look at how the Commonwealth Network can better support the conversion of cutting-edge science into business. And in particular, I'm asking the panel to look at how we can improve the ecosystem for scientific collaboration and for commercialisation of research across the Commonwealth. Yesterday, Secretary of State Penny Mordaunt at the UK hinted a new development strategy, embracing innovation, when she welcomed the critical role that fintech will play in supporting prosperity across the Commonwealth. She said, the open door to a future free from aid dependency. And this morning, Bill Gates said, as long as we invest in young people, they will innovate in a way we never imagined. And I very much liked Bill Gates' emphasis on them rather than us. In other words, finding ways to support rather than direct. The Commonwealth has a long history of promoting scientific research and innovation. In recent years, this element of the Commonwealth has not been as active as it could be. Technological innovation is key to tackling unemployment, especially among young people. And automation may disrupt employment. Transitioning to a digitised economy requires new investment, jobs, skills, especially in industries relevant to technology-driven fourth industrial revolution. One view, voiced in The Economist last week, questioned the view that the Commonwealth could be seen as an alternative to the European Union with trade, most hopefully as a would-be trading bloc at a time when Europe has been growing a lot more slowly than countries in the Commonwealth. But they argue that a glance at the statistics show that trade with the Commonwealth is small in comparison. Whereas the EU, for example, with Britain, accounts for nearly half of Britain's trade, the Commonwealth accounts for just a tenth, and its share's been slightly falling. It also quoted a senior diplomat that the Commonwealth has no capacity on trade. We see it as a useful adjunct to our engagement with small island nations, but give it no priority. However, there are other views, and another way of looking at Commonwealth cooperation is through the Commonwealth advantage. The combined GDP of Commonwealth countries is estimated at 10.4 trillion, that was in last year, and predicted to reach 13 trillion in 2020. When both bilateral partners are Commonwealth members, they tend to trade, on average, 20% more and generate 10% more foreign direct investment flows than otherwise. And so this Commonwealth effect or advantage implies bilateral trading costs between Commonwealth partners are on average 19% points lower than other countries. So with that, I'm going to go to the panel, but I'm hoping that they're going to take into account some of the barriers, but also the advantages around, for example, infrastructure, IT, technological innovation, the issue about IP and other things which both help and hinder innovation, from innovation to incorporation. And so the first question I'm going to ask is, by working together, can the Commonwealth increase the conversion of innovative ideas into profitable enterprises? And welcome Professor Andy Hopper to the stage. Thank you.
Shall I go from up there?
You can go from up there or the seat.
No, I think I'll go from the seat, actually. Okay, well, first of all, Royal Society, it's a Commonwealth organisation, and so we have fellows, we have the good fortune of fellows of people from countries in the Commonwealth or people working in the Commonwealth, and the president is of Indian origin, so Venki Ramakrishnan, a Nobel Prize winner. Now, I'm a computer guy, and there's the most amazing transformation happening in our society globally, which means there are tremendous opportunities and one or two worries. And the transformation I would summarize as follows. Everything in life, everything will have a digital representation, already partially has, from where things are to your DNA to everything that can be transmitted around the planet for next to no cost. It can be processed for next to no cost, can be stored for next to no cost, and on the other end are 8 billion people with mobile phones who can receive, I would suggest, the benefit of that. So that's a tremendous change, and we're kind of a third, maybe halfway through that at the moment. So everybody has a tremendous opportunity, although it's pretty damn disruptive. And so following that point, I think the role of training in universities is very important for enterprise, not just for societal broader good, which I very much applaud, but to make money, to pay your mortgage, to have a happy life and a sufficient life for your family. But to address Joanna's point about access and so on, a very interesting thing has happened and is happening, which is that that digital platform is available globally to the smallest of countries as well as the larger countries. And on that digital platform, there is provided for next to no cost processing power, storage, all the things I've just mentioned. So the opportunity, the infrastructure is already there. So I've worked with Makerere University in Uganda over some years, and I've seen it over the last 10 years go from introducing a computer science department to having an innovation cluster which works rather well because there's a cohort of students there now who have become entrepreneurs, and they are using that. They're using those platforms because the barrier to entry is fairly small to have successful businesses. And furthermore, they have the shot at selling to the rest of the world, Commonwealth and beyond, their rather interesting things which they come up with in their culture. So, I'm rather optimistic that the disproportionate lowering of cost, if you like, to have access to that infrastructure provides for all sorts of innovation opportunities. And I really do think there are all sorts of products that can be developed there. I'm talking digital here, which we here will find attractive because, for example, they're cheaper or whatever because their environment caused them to work in a particular way. Thank you.
Thank you. Azman.
I come from, can you hear me?
I'm not sure if your mic's working. Will you say something?
Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Well, I come from, I'm wearing two hats here. I come from the Malaysian Investment Development Authority, which primarily we are industry development and investment promotion agency of Malaysia. And we have been around for the last 50 years. And, throughout the years, we managed to bring on board about 5,000 foreign companies as well as a few more thousands domestic companies to invest in our economy. And after 50 years or so, we realized that industrial development without innovation is not going to be a sustainable business model. And there are many other organizations that has been set up by the government to spur innovation, and I'm involved in one of them called CREST, and I chair the board of CREST, which comprises the multinationals and also local SMEs and research institutions. So it's like a triple helix organization that tries to leverage the industry-driven research. So it was set up by the government in 2012, and so we have some milestone that we have achieved, and we believe we need to catalyze this growth through innovation, but it has to be market or industry-driven. So we have been working with many universities in Malaysia. We also collaborate with a number of universities in US and in UK, as well as some of the multinationals that are doing business in Malaysia. So basically, maybe later I can share some of the examples and also what we have created, the ecosystem of innovation or research by using industry, government, and also the research institution in Malaysia. We believe we have achieved something that can be, we can share and other countries can leverage on.
Can you give an example? We were talking earlier. You had an example of one fantastic collaboration which you've just brought to market.
Yes, we have this inventor out of Australia, the stethoscope. You know the normal stethoscope you have. Something plugged in your ear and you have wired, and the doctor can check your heartbeat and so on. So that has been converted into a digital stethoscope. It's called STETI, and they have the software and the sensors, and it will record the readings that need to be read by your cardiologist, and they will use artificial intelligence in the future to do more analytics, and I believe it will transform the healthcare industry in a way. And so this inventor came to us, and we facilitated this inventor to use our platform to manufacture and put in the necessary components and software, and now they have launched this product. In fact, they have gotten the approval of FDA in the US. So it's not yet widely used, but Malaysia is going to promote, because we have our healthcare industry. We have the second largest company that owns the hospital in the world. We also have many other healthcare companies that operate hospitals in Malaysia and in other countries. So some kind of very connected ecosystem. Not only that we developed over the last 50 years, but because of our companies that have invested in Turkey, in India, Singapore, and a few other countries in healthcare, we think we can roll out this kind of innovation to the market.
Thank you. Can I move on now to Michael? You have, one of the enviable jobs, I think, in the world, running the Natural History Museum in the UK. But you also, I think, is less well known, is that you have a very active and large research staff there. Do you want to just talk about that?
Yes, well, I hope everybody in the room knows the Natural History Museum here in London, but I want to talk to you a little bit about what you might not know about the museum and why it's relevant to this panel discussion about science, business and innovation. So the museum's history, we go back to the formation of the original British Museum in the days of the British Empire, going out around the world, bringing back to this country great collections. So our collection is particularly rich from the Commonwealth. It is one of the great collections of the world, one of probably the 4 finest natural history museums in the world. But because of that breadth, our collection is undoubtedly the most important scientifically. We have a collection of about 80 million objects in our collection. Not the largest in number, but because of that breadth and depth, it's certainly the most scientifically important. We have, apart from our public-facing activities in the museum, we have a science base of scientific staff of about 350. We do consultancy work with industry as well as pure academic research with partners in over 70 countries around the world. Because that collection is a preeminent collection, it is, and our statutory purpose is to provide access to that collection for research purposes. It's used very actively by scientists all over the world. So apart from our own 350 scientists and 120 postgraduate students based at the museum, each year we get between 8,000 and 10,000 scientists from other institutions coming to use that collection for their own research. So a lot of that is pure academic research, and it really revolves around 3 big narratives that the museum is interested in. We're interested in the origins of our solar system, our planet, and the geological processes that drive that. We're interested in natural diversity, geological and, of course, biological diversity. And increasingly, we're interested in mankind's future sustainability. How do we live within the confines of the constraints of a single planet, at least for the time being? I say at least for the time being because we're also, because of that first narrative, very interested in space. And one of the first areas of innovation that we're involved in was we work with the European Space Agency and NASA on things like the design of the next rovers to go to Mars and bring samples back from that planet. We also work in our earth sciences with the extractive industries. We're increasingly concerned about what are the sustainable supplies of rare minerals that we require for the future. Where are we going to find enough cobalt and be able to extract that in a sustainable way for the sort of technologies that we want to drive in the future? A more practical, perhaps, in immediate terms, is industry tends to use our collections a lot for what we call design by nature. And perhaps the easiest example to explain of that one is Speedo, the swimsuit manufacturer, has produced something called the shark suit for the 2000 Olympics. And actually the work that Speedo did was in the museum, looking at the fine structure of shark skin. Sharks have little teeth on their skin that face backwards and create hydrodynamic properties that are quite interesting for elite swimmers, in that if you can reduce drag by even a minuscule amount, you can perhaps produce faster times. And indeed, the shark suit was designed, it was built or made, and indeed Ian Thorpe was a very successful swimmer at the 2000 Olympics wearing those suits. The last thing I want to say is that although museums are regarded as a repository of historic information, modern technologies are bringing forward what one might call a new enlightenment, because we can now use a variety of analytical and imaging techniques to create what I would call large data sets. So we are beginning to digitize our collection as a global resource, and we're working with institutions in other countries to find common ways of solving problems as to how do you digitize not just the collection items themselves, but the metadata about those collections. To give you some idea of the scale of use, only 4% of our collection is currently digitized in that way. But in just 3 years, we've had over 11 billion downloads of individual pieces of specimen data. We're working now on a global enterprise to look at what would it take to digitize the world's natural history collections and create a huge big data set. And the interesting thing is, we think there are about 1.5 billion collection items in museums around the world, and you only need to go to 70 institutions to get 95% of it. So it's a tractable problem that we're beginning to work on. How do you create that enormous data set as a resource for industry, academics, and others to use?
Wow, that's extraordinary. And actually, in the context of this discussion, I would say that there might be a Commonwealth advantage to start with some of the institutions in the Commonwealth first. Yeah. But you can come back to that one. I want to move on to Peter from Australia, a Commonwealth Science and Innovation Research Council. I hope I've got the acronym right. But do you want to talk a little bit about what CSIRO does and your view on innovation to incorporation?
Thanks, Joanna, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, it's actually the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. So the industrial was put in there nearly 100 years ago to emphasise the fact that we in fact have three things that we do. We work with the community, we work with industry, and we work where there's a national arrangement by our government to support those arrangements in the interests of Australia. So unlike a university, we're a strategic research organisation. We focus on things that are strategically and tactically important to Australia. We have a number of we're organised into business units. So for example, you'll see the breadth of what we do. We have a food and agriculture unit, a health unit, mining resources and energy unit. We have a big digital capability which we call Data 61. So there's nearly 1,000 staff in that. And that obviously reflects on how important that is to society and the economy. I worked a long time ago as a scientist in CSIRO, and I left and I came back. I now enjoy a board position, and I chair the Board Science Excellence Committee, which obviously reflects how important science is to our organisation. But CSIRO has changed in the last 20 years, and we have a much greater emphasis on the innovation piece. And by innovation, I mean creating benefit for Australia. And we do this by investing in our entrepreneurial scientists. Now, not all scientists wish to go the entrepreneurial path, but some do. And we create processes for them to realise their ambitions. And so we have both the infrastructure and the mentoring support to help our scientists, start up and eventually perhaps spin out of CSIRO. The other thing we do is, in parallel, we manage a series of funds. So our board, in fact, has a fund management committee, and we oversight a number of funds which go from experimental development to seed funding and then to early stage venture. So the venture fund is done in partnership and it's a separate entity. But so we are now able to take the science and take it through a series of funding steps. We don't go all the way, of course, but it's actually business ready by the time it finishes that process. The other thing which is important, I think, maybe conceptually we might pick up in this conversation this afternoon, is that we not only look inwardly and support our own entrepreneurs. Now we have the national mandate to work with other organisations, including universities, to provide the same sort of processes where those universities don't have them themselves. So we collaborate with nearly 30 of our universities in the country in this process, and they engage us in that process. And that's in addition to the collaborations we have scientifically. And I might point out, just by way of partly answering the question, is there a Commonwealth advantage? CSIRO already works with scientific organisations and industry in many of the Commonwealth countries. So I think if we can do that now, I think there's great potential if we put our minds to it and put the processes and arrangements in place to greatly expand on that. Last night I went to the pitch at the Palace, which I think some of my colleagues here went to, and it was great for me to see that because there were young entrepreneurs from all around the Commonwealth doing their pitches, and if they are an indication of the potential for scientific innovation, that's of real benefit to their countries and their, right? I think we have an obligation to really explore that, and this afternoon, as we talk, I think we should keep that in our mind because we all are going to have different needs, I believe, in terms of innovation, but it all comes down to some common behaviours, I believe, and we can work mutually together to support the innovation systems across the Commonwealth.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing that up. We'll come back to that in a moment. So, Mike.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Department for International Trade, but I've only taken up that post some 4 months ago. So I thought I'd draw a little bit on my experience of 40 years in electronics and telecommunications. And most of that telecommunications experience has been in mobile, and I think there's some interesting examples in that area. I tend to view that mobile and internet are two of the greatest platforms that were invented in the last century. And when you bring the two together, whether it be with a smartphone or a tablet, when you bring the two together, that releases a lot of power for innovation globally. A few examples. Some 15 years ago, somebody came up with the idea of transferring money via text messaging. Simple transferring of money. I can now say that more than $1 billion is transferred every day with mobile money. Now, we never thought of that here in Europe when GSM started here in Europe. We didn't really think that that sort of thing would take off, but it was unbelievable the way it's taken off. And its impact on communities, empowering women who might be leaders in a village, empowering new businesses has been phenomenal. And there are huge case studies. I'm very proud that my sister department, the Department for International Development, has had a big hand in maintaining some of that innovation with some funding schemes associated with all sorts of developing nation needs and so on. And recently, for example, we looked at solutions for disaster relief, innovation that may be happening in that sort of area. So using mobile and sensors to alert people if flood was on the rise, or perhaps identifying through mobile data records whether people were returning from a disease-driven country, perhaps to help them with the healthcare that may be necessary for returnees. So that digital egalitarianism really is a great leveler for innovation. But I think the youth of the Commonwealth is very powerful, and we see it wherever I go in terms of the way they think about things. They're not hidebound by history. They're not hidebound by perhaps their education. They often think about how do they solve problems. And your reference to Pitch at the Palace, well, certainly in my old company, Telefonica, we started one of the biggest incubators here in London called Wyra. That helps to support 50 startups a year here in this country. All the people are typically under 30. And it's amazing the ideas they come up with, often in combination of mobile and internet and a given problem that they're solving. And many of the folks have actually gone into the Pitch at the Palace type scheme because of that experience, after some mentoring, some rehearsal of business plans, some ability to look at better finances and money-raising schemes. That sort of experience and testing is part of training. And it's something that universities do really well. You know, I'm a strong believer in centers of excellence, whether it's to do with incubation or acceleration, whether it's to do with knowledge hubs, whether it's to do with universities that help that development of innovation. I also think there needs to be an eye on the big picture, the globalization issues of standards or perhaps some issues to make sure you can scale. But I think providing you keep an eye on that, then there's huge potential within the Commonwealth. And the fact that we typically share a common language called English and maybe some common history and culture and values. You know, we can all have our differences as individuals or individual countries, but actually that's a very powerful base to build on. And just to complete my brief intro, I think people trade with people, and even if historically the proximity of Europe has been very helpful, in a global trading world, I'm not so sure distance is quite so important for all goods. Digital ideas fly around the world at internet speed. They really move around. And certainly in my telco days, we would used to take the best ideas from around the world and implement them as quickly as we could here. And I think the same can be seen in other countries doing the same sort of thing. So happy to take any more questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So last but not least, Tim, do you want to talk through Oxentia's point of view?
Okay, so yes, I work for a company called Oxentia, which very few people have heard of, but you've heard of the University of Oxford. Oxentia developed out of Oxford University Innovation, which was the technology transfer company for the university. And we help people with innovation-based problems and activities outside of Oxford. So we try to take the 30-odd years experience we have from taking innovations out of academic settings and into the marketplace and into society from Oxford, as well as now 14 years experience of doing this and helping governments, companies, academics, entrepreneurs on most continents of the world and in some Commonwealth countries. And the one thing that attracts me, because this is my first opportunity to look at how we could take our experience to support the Commonwealth in this area is in the great diversity of resource that we share amongst the countries. From a trading perspective, there have been comments already made on that, and maybe that's more limited. We've already heard about the collection of artifacts that have been brought together in the Natural History Museum, some of them from Commonwealth origins and countries. Think about the innovations that there are out there. Think about how, with the increased technology in connectivity, and think about the youth and the next generation of people on how we could realize some great innovations from more diverse environments. And one of the things we look at in Oxford is how we can improve the productivity of innovation within our academic communities. How do we get more great science turned into great ideas? How do we get a better return on the publicly funded research that we are investing in the first place? This is taxpayers' money that we want to see impacted back into society, not just in this country, but globally. And so one of the programs that we've been looking at, which is what gives me some optimism, and one of the programs we've been delivering, is part of the UK government's Newton Fund program. And one of those programs is a capacity building and entrepreneur innovator support program called the LIF program, Leaders in Innovation Fellowship Program, which is managed by the Royal Academy of Engineering, and we've been involved in for the last 4 years. And we've just done an impact analysis of this to try and demonstrate the potential that we could perhaps mimic in another environment like the Commonwealth. What we see is in 3 years that program's been running, we have supported 300 to 400 innovators and entrepreneurs from 14 different countries with a diverse resource base and stage of economic development as there is in the Commonwealth. Those innovators have gone on to secure over $52 million of funding to further support their innovations, and it's created over 650 jobs. You can see the innovations from the support that we can bring from other more developed environments like the UK, like Australia, like Canada, to some of these other environments that are less developed. You can see how those innovations can move from idea through to production and entering the market and having impact on society. So I have great optimism in the opportunities that we may have here by working together in the right way in making more of the innovations that we could see in the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much. I see a sort of virtuous circle here between aid, development, and commercialization, in that if you, there's still a huge challenge. I mean, Andy, you started by talking about the technological advances to access cheap technology, which allows one to have a platform to develop ideas. But actually, 32 countries in the Commonwealth still need to have access to the internet in a meaningful way to actually enable that kind of innovation to happen. And so you have an anomaly between that statistic and what needs to happen there, and the pitch in the palace examples of most amazing youth entrepreneurs coming from many different countries with very many different local contexts that are local, national and global in implication if they can be developed. So I do have a question here, but I'm going to ask you two. One which is commercially viable innovation only possible in developed academic centres? But actually you could tie that to the question about in the context of CHOGM, where our leaders are meeting, is there something useful that a Commonwealth Innovation Fund could do to help harness the ingenuity of youth, create perhaps development funding through our departments of aid and development, but also have links to the innovation and science departments of BEIS and other governments to actually then take that development funding into the sort of more commercial fields and areas. So that's the question is an innovation fund going to help? And how do you kind of bridge the gap between developed and developing countries when you want to encourage universities and business to work together? Anybody? start?
Can I go
I'm
first?
going to pick on you.
I think an innovation fund is a great idea. Now, one of the things that I tried to stress about natural history collections, they are basically a research infrastructure for the world to use. The great thing about digital technology and the way that we can digitize the information about collections is it democratizes those collections. It makes enormous value of even very small collections in obscure places. And why is that important? It's important because we can get the full story. If you think about natural history objects in museums around the world, they are a record of what existed, when it existed, and where it existed. And we, although we might have the richest collection in the world, don't have every part of the geographical or temporal distribution of what happened in our planet. So I think an innovation fund that could help create this large digital infrastructure that I'm talking about is particularly valuable, because once it's available in digital form, that information can be put to good use. It can fuel research on the big global challenges that we face. And those global challenges actually don't recognize national boundaries. So I do believe that an innovation fund could be extremely valuable, and it could help lift those parts of the world where collecting objects has not been as important or as going on for as long as here in the UK and other major developed countries. But it could actually add enormous value to the global database of information that's available.
Thank you. Mike?
I think it's a good idea, but I'm not sure on its own money is enough. I think the other key ingredients have to go with it. So if we were to think about a three-legged stool on which some innovation could sit, I would like the other two legs to be skills and education. So where's the capacity to use the money? But another leg of the three-legged stool besides money might be data. If you don't have access to data and information, you can't normally start. And if we just take the example of the open data forum we have here in London, putting data from transport and from crime and from London city authorities into an open data hub has helped to create huge data innovation of apps and all sorts of new ideas about ways of handling data that weren't previously thought about. So I would say for each country, for it to work, it needs a strong data leg as well to help oil the wheels of innovation alongside the money and the education and skills.
Mm-hmm. Along with the training, which you pointed out, because actually there is a lot of emphasis on trying to build up training in countries where there isn't the same kind of infrastructure or investment that has been in higher education. But there's a recognition that it's no point training the brightest of that generation in other countries if they come back and there is no infrastructure for them to go to. So a lot of funding is now going towards building up research infrastructures in countries which then can collaborate and access funding through the global research funds, for example, but also then applying to, for example, the Malaysia Investment Corporation for their ideas to be developed.
I think it is possible. I agree with you that funding alone is not going to get us anywhere. It has to be a few conditions. Number one, you must have the right public policy towards education, towards research, and then access to information among Commonwealth countries. There must be a comfort level of sharing scientific information like what you have among Commonwealth countries. The second part is to this platform of collaborative research, market-driven model. I think it is proven in many countries. That could be expanded to the Commonwealth countries. As many of us can appreciate, Commonwealth countries, they are at different level of development. They may not have, the necessary infrastructure, today. Probably they are, work in progress in terms of developing those infrastructure. But I believe, we can leverage each other's strength to spur innovation in the respective countries.
Just going to ask a quick last question, then I want to turn it to the audience. But do you think science parks are one way of creating sort of ecosystems of international partnerships? I know that in China, for example, in many cities, these cities are actually investing in bringing in international partners into science parks, or are they actually boom and bust? And because I know a number of science park initiatives have actually been examples of failure where the ambition has turned into no more than sort of real estate players trying to attract players to initiatives. Do you think, though, that sort of idea of trying to bring international partners together in a science park might be one way of tackling that international ecosystem?
There's an initiative in a Latin American country that I won't mention, where there is a huge strategic plan to develop an innovation park. And I think that a key element of that innovation park and innovation parks in the future will be international partners. International accelerator programs and offering a route to access resources and markets and expertise in other innovation ecosystems where you don't have them yourself. And one can take that to an extreme of global digital innovation centers. So I think innovation parks will increasingly have international components within them. And I think that will help it'll help accelerate the development of certain innovation ecosystems.
Yeah.
Peter, did you want to come in?
I think it's going to be horses for courses. So it depends on what you already have in your system. So, I mean, in London, you've already got lots of universities and finance and places to do things. So that is already the system. You know, and I know in some cases the parks, because I've worked with some of them, haven't succeeded because they just become cheap places for people to live rather than actually addressing the real issues around innovation, which is the entrepreneurial effort and the funding and the skills and the regulation. So I think it's probably going to be something you wouldn't consider in isolation of all those other factors at it, and you would only go that way if you had very little in the way of a starting point. So it's going to be horses for courses, and I would think very carefully about it. Some countries have research parks that really work for whatever reason, and but they've often evolved in almost a trial and error way over many decades, and it's not always possible to duplicate those processes.
No, and there are some outstanding examples as well of entrepreneurial kind of spin-outs or innovation hubs which universities have created, and some are absolutely outstanding and some also haven't worked. I'm going to go over here so I can see better, so I can take questions. I'd like to take a series of 3 to start off with for the panel. So I can see somebody in the front. Can you ask could you stand up, give your name and make your question quite brief, please?
Oh, that's better.
I think during the discussions, the panel, the importance of skills and education has come up. I think Malaysia is a good example.
Sorry, could I have your name?
I'm from Bangladesh,
Okay.
Salahuddin Qasim Khan. I am on the National Skills Development Council, which is headed by a Prime Minister. So we are trying to put a lot of focus on skills development because we export expatriate workers who bring in $13 billion into the economy. But paradoxically, we are sending out $6 billion for professional managers. I mean, there is a mismatch. And here, I think Commonwealth universities and business schools can network and help create, say, countries like Bangladesh, which are at the point of takeoff. We are reaching middle income status. We have a growth rate of 7% plus. So I think a network of universities, business schools, I think Malaysia has done well by inviting British universities to set up offshore campuses like Nottingham University, Reading. I think this initiative of the top universities of the developed Commonwealth countries should be initiative which can be taken.
Okay.
And also the research institutions can also have this network. And why can't we have an Erasmus program as they have in the European Union?
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. The second question.
Hi, it's Adam Sliman from Wood. Just a quick question. We picked up about data is free, and we look at that aspect. Data centers last year, I think, consumed over 400 terawatts of power. As we're talking about climate change, that's more than the UK's annual production. Projected growth for data is going to be quadrupling within a few years, so that's adding sort of 3 UKs to the power network. Do we think there's going to be a point where data or big data is going to be a challenge, there's almost going to be a data limitation about the total energy consumed, and data would also be a challenge around that? Or what's your thoughts around sort of the limitations of how much data we can actually produce?
Thank you. And the last question of this first set. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michalis Michael. I'm the CEO of Digital MR, a technology company here in the UK. My question is about the title of this session is Innovation to Incorporation. And I'd like to ask if there are any thoughts from the panel about, well, incorporating a new idea is all well and good, but I think where some of these initiatives fall down is what happens after the incorporation, and how do we go to market, commercialization, investment. I think there is a big gap especially in Europe and probably in other countries as well, where startups get on the market with some brilliant ideas, and then the engineers can't take it forward.
Thank you very much. Right, we've got 3 excellent questions. The first on skills and education, a question about whether there should be an Erasmus scheme for the Commonwealth, but also the need for that kind of skills and education base. The second question was around, is there limits to big data, and what kind of technological challenges will that create? The flip side of that, because you mentioned climate, is of course that in many universities or countries where they are subject to climate change, radical climate change, how do they keep their data is another challenge. But that's the second question. And the third one is about innovation to incorporation. So the new idea is great, but what happens afterwards? Is there a gap, do you think, for startups and follow-on support? And what kind of advice would you give the questioner? So I'm not sure who wants to start.
Yeah, let me probably share some experience for the first question, and I will attempt to answer the third question. Well, since we have been doing this business of collaborative research in the last 6 years, actually we have 65 members from the university and industry, and we have created the ecosystem of this collaborative research. 2,000 databases of subject matter experts, 7,400 university and industry talent that we have engaged, 15 startups at Crash Place. We do provide some space for innovative companies to innovate, and 14 shared facilities with the university and industry, and also 118 R&D projects funded with the industry. So it's a government and industry investment in the collaborative effort. So if this model, we can expand amongst the Commonwealth countries, leveraging on each other's strength, I believe, from zero, you can gain something. And then from there, you can evolve into some more bigger things. You need market-driven or industry-driven research to create that wealth. And it is also an incentive for any entrepreneurs, because it is industry-driven. And you need a strong government intervention at the early stage, especially because it will reduce the risk of industry to fund those innovation or innovative research. The other question to the gentleman just now, the third question, most funds, don't invest or don't provide early stage, known, to many people, especially in the venture capital and also startup funds, valley of death. So that's why, government intervention by providing support, platforms, funds. We talk about Commonwealth innovative funds. I think that is where you should be targeting to address the valley of death. And that is what CRASH has done, where we, incentivize the industry by, giving some funding to encourage them to collaborate with the institution to do innovative research based on market-driven, industry-driven. So probably that is one of the ideas that you can take it on board to discuss about this Commonwealth Fund.
Thank you. Andy, did you?
Can I just try 2 of those on the innovation stuff? Look, 9 out of 10 companies fail. The best I've come across is 1 in 2 fail, the other fail. So you've got to plan for that. That's the nature of the beast. You've got to have a culture which accepts that, and you've got to be realistic with people. On the academic side, you say, okay, if you start this company, you still get promoted. And here is how the system will support you. On the enterprise side, you'll say, okay, you're getting a bargain, really good shareholding for your IP or whatever it is. And by the way, we're going to try and look after you in some way, because it's likely this one will fail, because that's reality. And I think if you're realistic with people, you get a better result than the sort of preaching and the formulaic sort of thing. And, maybe I've not been doing this long enough, but I can't, out of my department or other similar situations, I can't predict what will be successful. And the industrial-driven frequently has a surprise, which is why the large companies don't always just get the innovation right. So that would be there. On the climate, it's very interesting. Since I'm a computer engineer, let me give it a shot at that one. Because I'm very happy and then I'm desperately unhappy, okay? So the happiness is that sensing and then using the data, the sensor data, to then optimize into the digital and then feeding that back should be a win. In other words, the amount of energy you use to process the representation of the physical world, to optimize the traffic, whatever it is, should give you a loop which is positive. So in that sense, the more energy you use, the better, because you're saving energy somewhere else. The train wreck is blockchain. Normally, you have some idea of energy proportional computing. The more computing you do, the more energy you use. Now, we've got mining in blockchain, which at its very heart does puzzles in order to do a verification. And this is not energy proportional. It's actually wasting, and in fact, it's distributed. Everybody's doing useless work to prove a point, so to speak. It's a crypto point. And it's absolutely not energy proportional. In fact, it's so bad, I'm very, very concerned that for that specific thing, which seems to be taking the world, blockchain is the solution to everything, the energy stuff is a train wreck. So I don't think it can turn out. There are all sorts of other ways of doing it, which are a little better. Blocks of chains are an old idea, not a new idea. Blockchain, as in the crypto mining, is a particular specialist thing, which I think will have trouble from an energy point of view.
Thank you. Anybody else take any of these questions? We take 3 more, 3 new questions.
Can I just comment on that data point? I think we've been brought up in a technological revolution that makes us assume that access to data should be free, storage is not going to cost anything. Somebody told me yesterday, and it may not even be true, but it's an interesting idea, that more photographs have been taken in the last 2 years since the invention of photography. So if those kind of growth rates continue, how much redundant information, how much energy are we consuming storing redundant information? I don't think anybody's really addressing that question, and I think eventually we will need to. So I don't think I have an answer, but I think it's a very important question and one that we ought to be thinking about already.
Well, talking about the next generation or the generation afterwards, I have a photograph from a hotel in Delhi where a family were having breakfast and their literally 16-month-old toddler was using a tablet and looking at material. And so not only are we using much more ephemeral material and publishing it in some ways, but also the effect on a next generation of using it from a very, very early age is something that we also don't quite yet know how it will impact on us. Peter?
Can I just comment on the third question too, which was the innovation to incorporation question? And I'll just make an observation. So having kind of been in the innovation space for quite a long time and working with governments on their innovation policy approaches, I would say 15 years ago, the word entrepreneur was used, but it was a whisper. And the emphasis was on tax concessions and grants and collaborative grants. And today, of course, the entrepreneurship piece is said with a roar, and it's a global phenomenon. You can virtually go to anywhere, and there's a government policy on entrepreneurship. So the danger is, I'm speaking to governments now, the danger is that the policy settings just focus on that piece to the neglect of the other parts of the system. And smart countries actually look at other pieces of innovation in terms of capturing the benefit, and this includes looking at supply chains, all the regulatory issues around industry, and the issue of skills and attracting skills. So there's we should be taking a whole of ecosystem approach and what's best for that particular jurisdiction.
And that's a really interesting point, because actually one of the questions there is, how does business, government, universities, institutes actually talk to each other to understand that whole kind of chain that needs to be in place for things to be productive and for an entrepreneurial activity. So universities are experimenting. In Singapore, for example, undergraduates do 20% less curriculum because they need to spend more time being thoughtful, doing stuff on their own, being entrepreneurial. But whether governments are actually also thinking about the IP issues between universities and business to try to create the environment in which those things can be experimented on, to Andy's point, to allow failure and to grow a culture where failure is acceptable, because that's how you innovate, is also a great challenge. So I'm now going to take 3 more questions. There's one, number 1 is just here in the middle. It's a gentleman with a red pink tie.
Hi, I'm Chris Walker. I'm chair of the International Trade Committee for the FSB, Federation of Small Businesses. I run a small business which was a startup, and I've had experience of being a technology scout within universities. I'd like to ask the panel how we improve, as a small business, I run a small business, I find that interacting with universities, I'm expected to fit around the university programs to do research, innovation. In other words, if I have a problem to solve and I need the university's support, I find that typically I will have to fit into an MSc program or some other construct which is set out. And if I have a problem to solve, I have to solve it quickly, and I don't have necessarily the time to fit around that construct.
Thank you. Another question? Okay, number 2 is just here, and then we'll go to that one, the lady at the back, number 3.
Good afternoon. My name is John Keedar, UK Ordnance Survey. The panel made some good points about using data in innovation and releasing it, open data, making it available. But actually, in many of the poorer countries, that data is not available. And therefore the youth in those countries who want to innovate and create the great new app that beats Uber or whatever else, actually find it very difficult to do so. So how do we generate the same levels of reliable or trusted data in nations that don't have it available in order to generate that sort of digital innovation?
Thank you. And then the lady at the back.
I should apologize because I'm actually here for the Women's Forum, so I'm sort of crashing the party here.
You're very welcome.
I'm very interested in what you had to say, and that's why I'm here. I run an education foundation here in the UK, although I'm Canadian. I'm very interested in what you've shared through your panel, but my question is, the world of education is experiencing the most significant revolution it's ever had. So universities are not necessarily where we will find the answer to the challenges that we face today. In fact, many of the, I would say, successful ventures that are there, whether they're in the third sector or in the business sector, are not led by university graduates. And we have people like Sir Ken Robinson here in the UK that is advocating staying away from institutional education. So what do you think of that? What is your feedback to that?
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got three very different questions around, first of all, the interaction between universities and small businesses and how can we better create understanding, I suppose, to make it less of small businesses fitting into the construct of a university setting. The Ordnance Survey question around countries that don't have data available, how do we generate trusted data that they can use for the kind of creation of apps and other technology advances? And then the last one around the revolution in education, presumably and outside the academy, and the questions around successful ventures are often not led by universities. Is something that you welcome?
Well, let me attempt to address the third question. I tend to go to the last question. Probably sharing my experience. In my country, we have this mindset. The university is, living in their own world. Most of them are doing very fundamental research, looking for new technological frontiers. But a lot of gap in helping the industry to solve their problems, and from solving the problems, there will be some new innovation will be created. So this is the main issue that Malaysia faced for many years. So when we came up with the idea of collaborative research, then you bring the industry problem to the institution. Then the institution will use all their technical skills and capabilities to solve industry problems. You will bring the relevance of R&D institutions in supporting market-driven, industry-driven needs. So I believe the more of this being done in many countries, then you will see that those graduates and the faculty will be more relevant to the need of industry. In doing so, the university will be providing solutions to the community, and they will be able to serve and producing graduates and talent that fit the need of the industry. So we have seen many science parks around the world, but I believe only a few are successful ones. One of them is Hsinchu Science Park in Taiwan, where you have a lot of innovation that created great companies, and they have proven that with the government, strong government intervention and support, with the industry, you create economic wealth. So we need to bring real life, real projects to the institution, research institution, for them to solve. Then they will produce more industry relevant that can support the economic growth of some countries.
Thank you. Mike?
I'd like to take the last two questions together, if I may.
Yeah.
I think the answer to both is that the countries themselves need a digital strategy. And why am I saying that for education? I think actually when you start to take a digital lens, you start to question what courses are taught. You start to question how can the university provide a foundation, but further support to address digital issues. I answer digital strategy for data as well, because actually, unless you think what governments do in terms of transport or other areas or other levers that they have, you don't start to generate the data. So actually, to me, there's a top-down approach which says to the government, you need a digital strategy so you can release the power in education, but also the power of entrepreneurship, the power of innovation. And you're only going to do that when you start putting together data. So an example of that, I've chaired some big infrastructure projects in the past. And it's quite interesting when I've looked at different transport programs and they've come at me to say, I want to build this bridge or I want to build that motorway. And they lack a digital strategy in it. You know, a digital strategy that might say how sustainable the bridge is or how sustainable the road is. It may not measure the flow of traffic across the road. It may not have a digital strategy that looks at the sensors that could be part of the bridge or the road. Now, without getting too technical about it, a digital strategy around transport or a digital strategy around energy or a digital strategy around city governance, those to me start to gather data where you need to make sure your investments are sustainable, but that data can also be used for the purposes of innovation and encouraging education and experimentation with it. So I would like to take those two questions together. It's a digital strategy.
Thank you. Peter?
Yes, I'd like to build on that because I think that is the right approach, and I'd like to bring a few threads together. I was reminded yesterday when Dr. Liam Fox gave his remarks on the importance of trade, and he sort of developed this narrative: trade leads to prosperity and leads to inclusion and equality and security and stability. So, but I'd like to suggest right at the beginning there's one first step, which is innovation. You can't trade unless you've got something that's unique and valuable to other people who buy it. So innovation is the key step. And that ties into having an overall strategy. And maybe we didn't talk a lot about an innovation fund, but there could be multiple purposes for a fund. You know, it could be to support the startups, but it could also equally be to support infrastructure or strategy preparation. So maybe that's a useful Commonwealth thought bubble that if we're going to make a significant change to the prosperity and stability of some of our Commonwealth nations, having an innovation and digital strategy it's a long-term strategy, but it's a good step in the right direction.
So how about a Commonwealth-wide innovation strategy that would actually, for example, if you think about a network of over 500 universities and the student populations in those universities matched to the SMEs and business and trade investment boards of those Commonwealth countries, and how you could match the ambition and ideas of some of those students to the experience needed by SMEs, you'd have rather a powerful meeting place, if you like, or marketplace, which could be supported by the kinds of good practice examples that could be used on that hub. So I think we might want to suggest that during this CHOGM week to the heads of our governments. I think we've come to a close now. I'd like to thank the speakers for a fascinating range of ideas. I'm very struck by the data question, actually, which also taxed us to think more about the uses and misuses of that data. And the need for skills and education right at the beginning, in a way, through that whole chain of from innovation, or to create the circumstances for innovation all the way through to incorporation. I'd like to thank you all for your questions and thank the panel very much. Thank you.
Thank you.